Coming up next on the Cultural Connections podcast, we'll be joined by Shalmalee Ghate, Senior Revenue Specialist at the Revenue Development Foundation. We'll learn more about her work in East and West Africa, as well as a first-hand look at the COVID-19 pandemic in India. This episode is being recorded live on Friday, May 14th, 2021. This is the Cultural Connections podcast.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Ives, and I am the producer and host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to remind all of our viewers that are watching that we are recording this episode live on Friday, May 14th, 2021, on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. As a reminder, if you miss any portion of this episode, you can always go back following the broadcast to see its in entirety on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. In addition, we also broadcast this episode live, and we'll be broadcasting this episode following the live broadcast on Instagram, as well as listening platforms, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and many more. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our guest today. We are really getting cultural with our guest today, and we're taking you across the globe here with our guest. And our guest is Shalmalee Ghate. Shamalee is an international development specialist currently working at the Revenue Development Foundation, being embedded at the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Liberia, West Africa. She has experience in the natural resource governance sector with a license granting systems for the diamond, gold, and iron ore mines. Prior to this, she worked with the United Nations Capital Development Fund in Malawi, Grameen Bank and Trust in Bangladesh, and other institutions in India where she was born and raised. She completed her undergraduate education at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and she holds a Master of Philosophy in Development Studies from the University of Oxford, United Kingdom. Thank you, Shalmalee, for joining me today.
Thanks, Brian, for inviting me.
Thank you again. Well, for this episode today, we're going to be breaking the episode into 3 parts. The first episode, we're going to be talking about Shamalee's background. Followed by that, we're going to be discussing her career. And the last part of the show is going to be talking about the current COVID-19 situation in India right now, with the first-hand look on that. Shalmalee will be giving us a first-hand look. In addition, if we have some time, we'll get into some other discussion points on this. I also want to remind all of our viewers watching that today is, if you're watching during the live broadcast again on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, you may comment below with any questions you may have for during the broadcast, as we will gladly answer them for you. Just please be aware that we are only able to monitor one feed at a time. The first feed we'll be monitoring for the first 15 minutes, as I mentioned, will be Facebook. Followed by that, for the next 15 minutes, will be Twitter, and the remaining end of the broadcast will be on YouTube. We'll be watching our YouTube feed, as unfortunately we can't monitor all of our feeds at the same time. So I guess let's start, Shalmalee, with you telling our viewers a little bit about your background, and then we'll get into your career.
All right. So I was born and brought up in a beautiful, multicultural, multilingual port city called Mangalore on the west coast of India. And I was born in a family of 6, my parents, 1 sibling, and we also had grandparents living under the same roof, which is a kind of a common practice in this part of the world. I completed my schooling in Mangalore and then went on to pursuing my undergraduate studies at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. Funnily enough, I happened to meet my now husband, Alex, who is from Acton, Massachusetts at Clark University. Later, I attended my MPhil degree at University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. Post-education, I have been working in the field of international development, and I have been fortunate to work in various organizations. As you mentioned, I've worked for Grameen Trust, UNCDF, which is the United Nations Capital Development Fund, and currently I'm working for Revenue Development Foundation in a country called Liberia in West Africa. I'm embedded at the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Liberia at the moment. From about March 2020, I've been working at home due to the pandemic situations where we're all working from home. Sorry, Brian, I can't hear you.
Sorry, there we go. Sorry. Very interesting there. Let's get with the impressive background. and now we're going to jump right into it with your career, as you just started to allude to some of that stuff. And let's I guess start with the basic question here: is what got you interested in international development? Why did you want to go in this direction?
So, from as long as I can remember, I've always been wanting to be active in the community around me. When I was in school, I was involved in various NGOs that operate in Mangalore. I was heading some of the initiatives like Joy of Giving, where kids from affluent schools used to donate a toy to a kid who went to schools in the lower economic background areas and things like that. So I think that was always there in me. But as I grew up, I wanted to understand international development. I wanted to understand economic inequalities at a theoretical academic level. And so I pursued MPhil in development studies at the University of Oxford. And after completing my degree, I sort of wanted to combine what I studied theoretically into the practical experience I had gained throughout my life in the different internships and volunteerships I had done. So I ended up choosing a career in international development.
Oh, very interesting. Very, very interesting. So your career, as you mentioned, has spanned over multiple countries, specifically in the East and West Africa area, in Liberia, as you mentioned, as well as in places like Bangladesh as well. What would you say has been your biggest learning experience working in these multiple different countries?
I think I would say that one of the biggest learning has been that people are equally welcoming and warm in all different parts of the world. Initially going from India, which is especially Mangalore, which is a homogeneous society, going to a different culture used to make me a bit nervous. I didn't know how they would accept me as an outsider. But then I realized through my various missions in different countries that people are very warm, welcoming, and as long as you are somebody who's interested to learn about their culture and assimilate, they always have a place for you in the society. And that's been one of the greatest learnings I've had.
Great. Now that's very interesting. Then I guess on the flip side of that we talk about the biggest learning, the biggest thing you've learned from that. I guess we can tie that into then the similar question on then what has been the biggest challenge you have faced with working in so many different countries?
I think one of the biggest challenge has been working in settings that are not very well funded, that are low in technology or sometimes education capacity. Coming from, say, like having studied in the UK or the US, we are used to fast speed internet or a good infrastructure where you have public transport or roads or bike lanes and all of this. So going to a country like Liberia can be a transition since the country is still up and coming. Not all of the infrastructure is in place. So sometimes you go into the office and you have power cuts for a couple of days and you have to manage that. And those sorts of little things were something that I had to get used to over the period of time.
I see. Okay. Yeah, of course. Of course. Okay. Well, I think now let's start switching our gear over, because I think I wanted to spend a majority of this discussion on the COVID-19 pandemic in India, which recently here in the States, obviously we've been seeing the impact that this devastating virus that continues to really impact so many people worldwide. We saw it here in the United States. We continue to see it here in the United States, but recently everyone has turned their head to seeing what's happening over in India. And I guess before I dive deep into those types of questions, is why don't we start off with you giving us just an overview right now of exactly where things are currently happening with COVID-19 in India, specifically, and then we'll get into more specific questions.
Okay. Sadly, we are currently going through the second wave of COVID-19 pandemic now in India. We are mostly under a lockdown from the past 3 weeks. Cases have been slowing down in the recent 1 or 2 days, but I think we just have to be patient with the lockdown and follow the rules until we get it under control. Senior citizens have been vaccinated, which is great news, and 45 plus age group is now being vaccinated. A few days ago, they also opened limited slots for 18 plus age group. So we are making progress in terms of vaccination drives. So hopefully in the coming months, we will be able to come out of the pandemic.
Well, that would be excellent news, especially from what we're seeing. And I guess one of the questions I have here is seeing the, I mean, and it's something I think in general, a lot of people make the deception here that the media here in the States, and I think even around the world globally, we've seen this, especially in recent years, where the media can really sometimes go overboard with the way it covers a crisis like this COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen it here in the States with some of the information that they have provided here. What would you say that the media's portrayal of what is going on in India is accurate? And this includes social media too. We've seen so much here coverage every single day that continues to make, even though what you're saying, what I'm gathering is that yes, numbers are starting to slowly go down. And I do have the numbers here that as from what I read online within the last 24 hours, that there were at least, let's go with the deaths, almost 4,000 deaths within the last 24 hours of COVID-19 in India. Would you say that the media's portrayal is accurate? Same thing with social media, or do you think from what we're seeing here in the States that some of it is a little being overdone?
So I think it's a complicated situation. Of course, there is a lot of death and there are lots of infections in the country. So we have to take it seriously. It's not something to take lightly, of course, and it's a pandemic situation. But having said that, we are one of the largest countries in terms of population, right? We're the second largest in the world. So given the population, say 4,000 people for a city, even like my size, we have 500,000 people just in a tier 2, tier 3 city in India, yet alone in like big cities, we have hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people living in cities. So it is a relatively smaller number. But definitely there has been a shortage in oxygen beds or ventilators, especially because when there's a surge of infections and everybody wants a ventilator, the country is not prepared to give everybody a ventilator, right? Because in a normal situation, you don't have that many people wanting a ventilator. So of course there's a crisis, but I do think that the media only highlights the number of deaths and the devastation, but equally there are high number of people who are recovering from the infections every day, going back home from the hospitals, which is not as much shown in the media, unfortunately.
Of course. Now you just mentioned in that answer, you mentioned tier 2 and tier 3 communities. Can you explain what that means? What do you mean by tier 2 and tier 3 communities?
Okay, by that I mean, Mangalore would be considered probably a tier 2, tier 3 city because it's not one of the biggest cities in India. And we still have 500,000 people living here, right? So you can imagine the population density in this country compared to any Western nation for that matter. So just given the amount of people living in India, the number of infections are not that high, even though it is a serious matter and we have to take it seriously.
Right. Now, one of the things that at least this was as reported even just as around a week or two ago here in the States, and it seems like from what you're saying is that the vaccination effort is getting better. But if I'm not mistaken, just around a week or two ago, it was only less than 4% of the population in India that had been getting the vaccination. And I know that in other countries as well, there's been this huge concern, specifically to what I've read in reports that in like Thailand, where where the government is hoarding the vaccine for certain groups of people. What in India? What is? I mean, it seems like now the vaccination rollout is going better, and I know from here in the States as well that we have sent a lot of supplies down your direction along with vaccines. And I also know that India also has I think that they are using their own, or at least in the vaccines that we don't know about here in the States. We know about the main three here: Moderna, Pfizer, and the Johnson and Johnson vaccine. What is India doing to calm the nerves of doing to get people to get their vaccine?
So one of the things that has really worked in advantage for our country is that India is one of the biggest manufacturers of the vaccine for the world, as you may know. So that's been a really good thing for us, which means we have domestic capacity to produce vaccines. One of the most popular vaccine we use here is the AstraZeneca one, the one that has come out of the UK. It's being produced here in India. We call it Covishield, and then there's another vaccine called Covaxin. Right now, I recently heard that the Russian vaccine has come to India, and as you rightly said, the United States has sent a lot of help. So with all of that, I'm sure we'll be in a better place in the coming months. We are a large population, 1 billion people. So it is hard to vaccinate everybody in a very short period of time, especially when a majority of our population is rural. We need to make sure there's infrastructure in place to vaccinate everybody. And having to give 2 doses also complicates it, right? Like you have to give the first dose and then make sure the person gets the second dose. So it is a longer process. So I think it will take a couple of months for our country to come to grips with the situation, but I'm really hopeful that we will be okay and that things will be better.
Oh, that's what anyone can really hope for. And before we go any further, I just want to remind all of our viewers here that we are recording this episode live on Friday, May 14th, 2021. We are recording this episode live on 3 platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So to any of our viewers that are watching with us live, if you are watching through Twitter right now, that is the feed that we are currently monitoring for the next 10 to 15 minutes. From that, we're going to move over to our YouTube feed. We'll still try to jump back between all 3 of them from time to time. So if you have questions, you may put them in any of the comment below, and we will gladly answer them for you. Talking here about the COVID-19 pandemic, from what it seems as though as we watch in India, as numbers continue, it looked like we're finally we've reached the peak, and it looks like that maybe numbers, knock on wood, are starting to slowly come down. But we're watching in areas neighboring which are also getting significantly impacted. Like we've seen, there's been reports coming out of Nepal, which has been getting greatly impacted recently by this pandemic, with numbers soaring there. And these are places that originally, it shows you again, we still don't know the entirety of this virus, but we've saw these areas. Well, the states here in the States, we were getting ravaged left and right by this pandemic, but now we're starting to see, as we make a turn, these other countries are starting to see it really bad, specifically Nepal. Now, being so close to Nepal, it's obviously a different story, I'm assuming, with getting a vaccine rollout over there. By any chance, do you know what the success rate in getting a vaccine rollout is going on over there by any chance?
I am not up to date with their vaccination programs, but I have been following the news in Nepal, and it is very sad indeed. It's the same, I think, what's happening in India is now starting to happen in Nepal. The cases are going up. Yeah, I can only hope that maybe with enough protection and lockdowns, they'll be able to overcome it in the short run, and then, of course, vaccinations in the long run. It is a challenge for sure, Brian. It's something that we've been fighting. As you rightly said, we were watching this in the media so much last year and hearing about the United States, hearing about Italy, hearing about Germany, France, and now it's the same thing happening here. And right before India, it was Brazil that was in the news a lot. So it's something that's going around the world. And sadly, this is the situation, I guess, we have to all face.
Yes, no, of course, agreed. Then in that case, as we talk about this virus and the COVID-19 pandemic in India, it seems to be that, I mean, is that that you talk about the lockdown there. And I know when we think of a lockdown, when we talked about lockdowns here in the States, which we went through a lot of last year, a lockdown here in the States basically meant that restaurants weren't allowed to have indoor dining or any type of, or have any type of, say indoor, or at the time it wasn't even outdoor dining, any You could only do takeout or delivery. And this was right, I'm talking right at the height of the pandemic here for us, that restaurants had to fully shut down, movie theaters, gyms, whatever you can think of, basically retail, everything was shutting down left and right, which obviously had its devastating impact on the economy. Now, in India, they take a little bit more on, it seems, the more conservative approach to a lockdown with this COVID-19 pandemic. Can you explain what in India, what a lockdown looks like compared, obviously, compared to what I'm saying, what we looked at here in the States?
So we had different forms of lockdowns over the time. Last year, for about 3 months, we had a complete shutdown. As you explained, no restaurants, no retail shops, no businesses were open, and only essential services such as groceries, medicines, hospitals were pretty much open. That lasted for about 3 months in 2020. And then from May, June onwards last year, life started to slowly come back to normal. And there was a feeling that maybe we're done with the pandemic and that we've come out okay. However, it was kind of shocking during the month of March in 2021. Suddenly, the number of infections rose and it came out of nowhere. And suddenly, there were infections everywhere. Hospitals were being overwhelmed. And then we went back into a very strict lockdown to curb the spread of infections. So from the past 3 months in my city, we have been on a very strict lockdown. We are allowed to go to fetch essential services such as groceries or milk or other things between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. in the morning. And then everybody's supposed to be indoors after that, and all the economic activities shut. Only food delivery, grocery delivery, and pharmacies and hospitals are open. People are only allowed to move around if they're going for a vaccination or if they have a flight to take or a train to catch, and for some very important medical emergency or family emergency. Other than that, they are supposed to stay indoors. And the other essential service that's obviously open is the financial services, like the banking industry, and some of the major government wings are open. But other than that, most of the economy is shut.
Right. No, of course. And that makes perfect sense there. Then you mentioned how the cases skyrocketed out of control in March 2021. And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, before this, the number of the vaccination rate was below 3% or something like that. What was the decision making behind of trying to put things back to no? I mean, even here in the States, we were not easing back into normal activity until people really started getting vaccinated. And that's what we're starting now, finally, to see that things are starting to get back into a normal situation. But in India, it seems like it was almost in a way backwards, where they said, let's reopen things, even though people aren't vaccinated. What led to this? What kind of idea thought was to do that, that the government thought that this would be some sort of smart, I guess, idea, or not so smart?
Yeah, yeah. Well, in the hindsight, yeah, definitely not so smart. But I guess at the time, number of cases were pretty low, and even after opening up the country, say from like March 2020 up until, May 2020 up until say March 2021, things slowly started to open up and people were normally doing their life, of course wearing a mask and all of that. So it was not completely what it was like before, but it was more or less normal, I can say. And I guess the rationale was that hospitals weren't overwhelmed, right? So we didn't see cases to a point where there were no ventilators or there were no hospital beds anymore. It didn't seem like a crisis situation, even though COVID was around, many infections were around. It wasn't spreading as fast as it is in the past couple of months. Suddenly, around March 2021, we saw a huge, sharp rise in the number of infections, number of hospitalizations. Hospitals started complaining that there's not enough room to accommodate everybody who's coming in for ventilators. And that's when the crisis situation really started back up again.
I see. Well, again, before we go further, I just want to remind our viewers that we're recording this live here on 3 different platforms. We're live on Friday, May 14th, 2021. And we are recording this live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube with our guest Shalmalee Ghate, who is talking with us about both her work that we started with on her work in international development, and right now, as we start to transition our discussion, we've been talking about the devastating impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on India, but really, obviously, worldwide. And now let's switch into a more lighter note here in the last 5-10 minutes that we have, to talking about an interest of yours that you mentioned to me, which is about Indian classical dance. You have a very big interest in that. And why don't you first start off telling us what is Indian classical dance?
Okay, so there are about 7 forms of Indian classical dance forms in the country, which date back to roughly 2000 years. Some of them are more recent, and the one that I practice is a pretty old dance form that has been developed over centuries. There are manuscripts, and there are temples with demonstrations of the various dance poses that you can see across the country. The form I practice is called Bharatnatyam. And recently I finished my Vidvat grade exam, which is the master's equivalent in the dance form. I have been practicing it for over 20 years now. It's something I enjoy doing. I feel like it brings me closer to the culture in my hometown, especially when I'm away from home. It really helps me to sort of stay connected, and that's why I love doing it.
And now, what would you say then got you interested in learning this dance? Why did you want to get interested in doing this? What got you interested in it?
I think initially my parents just sent me to the dance school because, parents want you to be active and be trying out new things. That's how I started going to the dance class around the age of 5. But I think slowly it started to really grow on me. I loved doing it. I wanted to go there. I had a group of friends that I did it with. So then slowly it became my passion. But really, until sort of the past 2-3 years, I didn't pursue it as a strong passion, but I think as an adult, revisiting something that I have been doing all my life has just been amazing. Like, I can read books now, I can read scriptures now, I can visit temples and understand it at a deeper level in a way I wouldn't be able to when I was 5 or 6 when I started off, right? So it's been a great experience coming back to it as an adult and learning it again and taking exams and all of that. So yeah, I'm enjoying it at the moment, and I keep doing it, especially during the lockdown. It's something that keeps me in good shape and good mental health and physical health. So I love doing that.
Right now, of course, during this pandemic, obviously this COVID-19 pandemic, and especially now, you mentioned that you can go out and see these types of performances. I assume, obviously, likelihood is you're not going to see as much of that right now. In the middle of this pandemic, but if we weren't in the middle of this pandemic, would this be something you would see all over in India, or is it something you would see only? I mean, with the people, is this something a regular thing that you would see all throughout India?
Yeah, so the 7 different forms are from 7 different parts of India. The one I perform is closely linked to the southern part of India. So yes, it is pretty widely practiced in temples, in ceremonies. So if you're able to just go to a temple during an auspicious day, probably you'll catch a glimpse of somebody performing this dance form there. It's very much seen as a holy thing to do. It's a form of worship of God. It's seen as a form of offering to God. So it has a lot of cultural and religious connotation to it, unlike, say, the modern dance forms like hip hop or break dance or whatever, which is a more modern version of dancing. This is the classical version. So it has roots in history and tradition and culture that dates back to thousands of years.
Very, very interesting, and a nice little light way to end our quick. It's amazing. I say it every single time I do this podcast. It's amazing how fast a 40-minute broadcast goes by. Again, just to remind our viewers that we're watching that as we just wrap up, if you have any last minute questions you'd like answered while I am wrapping up here and you're watching through YouTube, we're live here on Friday, May 14th, 2021, with our guest Shalmalee Ghate, who has been talking this entire time about her background, her career in international development, big discussion on the COVID-19 pandemic in India, and also we just learned about an interest on hers of Indian classical dance. All making for a very interesting cultural show today. Hence, cultural connections. But with that said, I want to thank you, Shamalee, for joining me today again on the podcast. And again, reminding to our viewers that this podcast is always available to re-listen to on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. In addition, you'll always be able to find it for watching on Instagram, as well as listening platforms, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, just to name a few, along with the local cable television station in Newton, Massachusetts, where we broadcast from. It is also available for both listening as well as now watching on the station at certain times of the day. So again, I want to thank you, Shamalee, for joining me today, and stay tuned for further episodes of the Cultural Connections podcast. I'm Brian Ives, and I'm the producer and host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us for this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast. To learn more about this episode, be sure to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also listen to this podcast in its entirety on listening platforms Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Breaker, Radio Public, New TV, and many more of your favorite podcasting platforms. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast.